Dr. Malachi Bishop, a prominent black surgeon, becomes the target of a racist police officer's campaign of harassment, abuse of power, and fabricated accusations after a heated encounter in a hospital parking lot. The officer, emboldened by systemic biases, seeks to destroy Malachi's reputation and career, exposing the deeply ingrained racism in America's institutions. As Malachi fights back, he uncovers corruption and prejudice that extend far beyond his personal ordeal, revealing the infuriating reality of how racism operates unchecked. This gripping tale challenges the audience to confront injustice and question the systems that allow such abuses to thrive. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the sterile office as Maya Castillo finished her last report for the day. It was a late Friday evening, and the quiet of the nearly empty government building felt almost oppressive. Her desk, lined with neat stacks of case files, reflected her methodical approach to her job as a financial analyst for the city's Ethics and Compliance Division. Maya was the kind of person who thrived on order and precision, a stark contrast to the chaos she often uncovered in her work. Tonight, however, something felt off. Her latest assignment, a routine audit of municipal contracts, had revealed anomalies she couldn't ignore. Numbers that didn't add up. Payments routed through shadowy third-party vendors. Maya had flagged the irregularities and sent her findings up the chain, but the response she received was unusually terse. "Drop it." She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The anomalies weren't just clerical errors, they were deliberate. Someone was siphoning millions from city funds under the guise of infrastructure projects, and whoever it was had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. The deeper she dug, the more intricate the web became, linking back to powerful individuals who wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who got in their way. The faint sound of footsteps broke her concentration. Maya glanced at the clock. 9:47 p.m. The cleaning crew wasn't due for another hour. She quickly saved her files to an encrypted drive and closed her laptop. Her heartbeat quickened as the footsteps grew louder, echoing down the corridor. "Hello?" she called out, trying to sound calm. Her voice barely carried over the hum of the lights. No response. Maya stood, her eyes scanning the room for anything that could be used as a weapon. A moment later, the shadow of a man appeared at the edge of the glass partition. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a security uniform. But something about him didn't sit right. "Miss Castillo," he said, his voice smooth but unsettling. "You're here late." Maya forced a polite smile. "Just wrapping up, can I help you?" "You can," he replied, stepping closer. "We've been monitoring your activity. Some of your inquiries are problematic." Her blood ran cold. "I don't understand, I'm just doing my job." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Your job ends here." Before she could react, he lunged, but Maya was faster. Grabbing her laptop, she ducked under his outstretched arm and bolted for the exit. Her heels echoed against the linoleum floor as she ran, her mind racing with one thought. She had to get out. She had to expose the truth. The chase had begun, and Maya Castillo was now the hunted. The rhythmic clinking of spoons against porcelain cups, and the soft hum of conversation filled the small corner diner. It wasn't a place anyone would expect to find Dr. Malachi Bishop, one of the most renowned neurosurgeons in the country. But that was precisely why he came. Nestled in a quiet suburb outside Atlanta, the diner was unassuming. A relic from the 1960s, with checkered floors and red vinyl booths that squeaked when you shifted your weight. The neon sign outside flickered faintly, promising coffee and pies, just like Mama made. Malachi liked the simplicity of it, the way it felt far removed from the opulence and scrutiny of his everyday life. He sat in a booth near the window, wearing a crisp white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle. His polished leather shoes peeked out from under dark slacks, but despite his tailored appearance, he carried himself with an air of approachability. His salt and pepper hair was neatly cropped, and his deep brown skin seemed to glow under the dim diner lights. Malachi stirred sugar into his coffee, his large hands moving with precision. Across from him sat his niece Jada, a precocious college junior, who had an uncanny ability to make him laugh, even on the most difficult days. She was telling him about her sociology project, her hands animated as she spoke. "And get this," she said, her almond eyes wide with disbelief. They actually tried to argue that systemic bias isn't real. Like, can you believe that? In 2024? Malachi chuckled softly, his deep baritone carrying warmth. Sweetheart, I can believe just about anything these days, but I'm proud of you for holding your ground. Jada beamed, her smile as bright as his mother's had been. Well, you taught me that never let anyone make me question my worth. The words settled over him, carrying a weight he didn't show. Malachi often thought about the tightrope he walked as a black man in his position. Wealthy, respected, yet constantly reminded that success didn't insulate him from prejudice. His career was built on excellence, yes, but also on the resilience to navigate spaces where he was often the only one who looked like him. He glanced out the window, taking in the bustling scene outside. The diner was across the street from a high-end boutique, where patrons in designer outfits flitted between racks of clothing. Malachi didn't need anything from there, but Jada had insisted they stop by before heading back to her dorm. She had her eye on a jacket, something she'd seen online and saved up for. When they finished their coffee, Malachi left a generous tip on the table and held the door open for Jada as they stepped into the crisp afternoon air. The boutique's sleek glass exterior stood in stark contrast to the diner's worn charm. Inside, the atmosphere was meticulously curated. Soft jazz played over hidden speakers, and the air was perfumed with something floral and expensive. A sales associate greeted them at the door, her smile tight and her eyes darting to Malachi's clothes. He noticed the flicker of judgment, but ignored it, stepping aside to let Jada take the lead. She made a beeline for the jacket display near the back, her excitement palpable. As Jada tried on the jacket, Malachi wandered toward a display of cufflinks. He wasn't particularly interested in buying anything, but he appreciated craftsmanship, and the intricate designs caught his eye. Sir, can I help you? The voice came from behind him, sharp and tinged with suspicion. He turned to see another sales associate, a younger man with perfectly coiffed hair and a name tag that read, Liam. The man's expression was polite, but his posture was stiff, his eyes scanning Malachi as though assessing whether he belonged. I'm just looking, Malachi said evenly, meeting Liam's gaze without flinching. Liam's smile didn't reach his eyes. These are quite expensive, he said, gesturing to the display. But we do have more affordable options near the register. Malachi's lips pressed into a thin line. He had encountered this before, the coded language, the subtle attempts to make him feel out of place. But before he could respond, Jada called out from across the boutique. Uncle Malachi, what do you think? She spun around in the jacket, her face lit with joy. He smiled, momentarily brushing off the interaction. Looks perfect on you. Jada's attention shifted to a nearby mirror as she admired the fit. Meanwhile, Liam stepped closer to Malachi, lowering his voice. If you're not planning to purchase anything, I'd appreciate it if you didn't handle the merchandise. The words were delivered with practiced civility, but they landed like a slap. Malachi straightened to his full height, towering over Liam. His voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. Are you implying I can't afford this? Liam hesitated, clearly realizing he had misjudged the situation. Oh no, sir, I didn't mean… Malachi cut him off, his tone measured but firm. You didn't mean what to assume that I don't belong here? Before Liam could stammer out a response, another voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? The boutique's manager, a woman in her 40s with a sharp bob and an air of authority, approached them. Her eyes flicked between Malachi and Liam, taking in the unease on the younger man's face. Malachi turned to her, his expression composed. Not at all. Your associate was just reminding me of where the affordable options are. The manager's eyes widened, and she shot a glare at Liam. I apologize for any misunderstanding, Sir Liam. Why don't you assist another customer? Liam slinked away, his face flushed with embarrassment. The manager turned back to Malachi, her tone conciliatory. Please let me know if there's anything I can help you with. Malachi nodded, his voice cool. Thank you, I'll keep that in mind. Jada returned to his side, oblivious to what had transpired. Uncle Malachi, can we get this? I saved up, but I'm a little short. I'll pay you back, I promise. Malachi smiled down at her, his anger melting away. You don't have to pay me back, Jada. It's yours. As they approached the register, The manager herself handled the transaction, offering a discount and a string of apologies that Malachi barely acknowledged. He left the boutique with Jada, the crisp bag in her hand and a weight in his chest that he couldn't quite shake. Back in the car, Jada chattered about her plans for the jacket, but Malachi's thoughts lingered on the encounter. Moments like these were a reminder that no matter how far he had come, there were still barriers he couldn't escape. But he didn't dwell on it for long. He had faced worse and risen above it. This was just another chapter in a story he knew all too well. And while he couldn't change everyone's perception, he could ensure that Jada never doubted her worth. As they pulled away from the boutique, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the road ahead. Malachi tightened his grip on the wheel, his mind already turning toward what awaited him at the hospital the next day. A life-saving surgery that only he could perform. The sun dipped behind the hills as Malachi and Jada drove back toward the city. The jacket she'd chosen lay neatly folded in a boutique-branded bag in the back seat. She was practically glowing, chatting about how she planned to wear it to an upcoming student debate competition. Her enthusiasm was infectious, but Malachi's mind was elsewhere, replaying the encounter with Liam. "Uncle Malachi?" Jada's voice broke through his thoughts. "You okay?" He glanced at her and forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just thinking about the week ahead." "You're always thinking about work," she teased. "You need to take a break once in a while, maybe even go on a date." Malachi chuckled, the tension in his chest loosening slightly. "I'll take that under advisement, Dr. Castillo." She laughed, shaking her head. "You know, someday I'm going to call you and say the same thing back to you." He glanced at her with a raised eyebrow. "Oh, so we've already decided on med school now?" She smirked. "Maybe you'll just have to wait and see." As they pulled into the city, Malachi noticed the streets were busier than usual. A local football game had just ended, and clusters of fans in jerseys were spilling out of bars and restaurants. He tightened his grip on the wheel, navigating the chaotic traffic with practiced ease. "I need to stop at the hospital real quick," he said. "I left some notes for tomorrow's surgery in my office." Jada groaned playfully. "See, workaholic." "It'll only take a minute," Malachi said, smiling. "Promise." The hospital parking lot was nearly empty as they pulled in, the bright floodlights casting long shadows on the pavement. Malachi parked near the main entrance, and they stepped out into the crisp evening air. He led Jada toward the glass doors, his ID badge clipped to his shirt pocket. As they approached, a security guard stepped out from the booth near the entrance. He was a burly man with a buzz cut and a flashlight in hand, his face set in a permanent scowl. "Can I help you?" the guard asked, blocking their path. Malachi reached for his badge. "I'm Dr. Malachi Bishop. I need to grab something from my office." The guard's eyes flicked to the badge, then back to Malachi's face. His expression didn't change. "Sorry, but I'll need to verify that with the hospital." Malachi's brows furrowed. "You're welcome to call upstairs, they'll confirm." The guard didn't move. Instead, his gaze shifted to Jada. "Who's she?" "My niece," Malachi replied evenly. "She's with me." The guard hesitated, then shook his head. "You'll have to wait out here. Hospital's policy, no unauthorized visitors after hours." Malachi took a slow breath, steadying himself. "I'm aware of the policy. It doesn't apply to family members accompanying staff. Now, if you'll excuse us, I'm on a tight schedule." The guard stepped closer, his posture stiffening. "I said you'll have to wait. Rules are rules." Jada looked up at Malachi, her eyes wide with confusion. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but inside, his frustration simmered. This wasn't the first time he'd been stopped or questioned in a space where he should have been above suspicion. He had fought too hard and achieved too much to still be treated as though he didn't belong. Before he could respond, a familiar voice called out from behind them. "Dr. Bishop!" A nurse in scrubs hurried toward them, her tone warm and slightly apologetic. "I'm so sorry about this, Jerry. He's fine. He's the chief of neurosurgery." The guard's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked it with a curt nod. "Just doing my job." Malachi didn't respond. Instead, he gave the nurse a grateful smile and guided Jada through the doors. They walked in silence until they reached the elevator. "Uncle Malachi?" Jada started, her voice uncertain. Why was that guy so rude? Doesn't he know who you are? Malachi pressed the button for his floor, his jaw tightening. Some people assume things, Jada. That's all. But why? He sighed, struggling to find the right words. Because the world isn't always fair, and sometimes, it doesn't matter what you've achieved. People still see you through their own biases. She frowned, her young face filled with indignation. That's so stupid. It is, Malachi said quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. But it's why you can't let anyone define your worth. You have to know who you are and stand firm in it. Jada nodded, but her expression remained troubled. Malachi felt a pang of guilt. He had spent his life shielding her from this reality, hoping she wouldn't have to face the same obstacles he had. But moments like this reminded him that the fight wasn't just his, it was generational. When they returned to the car, Malachi noticed a patrol vehicle parked near the lot's exit. 2 officers stood beside it, their figures silhouetted against the flashing blue and red lights. As he approached, one of them raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "Evening, officer," Malachi said, as he rolled down the window. "Is there a problem?" The officer, a stocky man with a clipboard, leaned in slightly. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Just need to ask a few questions." Malachi's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Suspicious activity? This is a hospital." The officer shrugged. "That's what the call said. Mind telling me what you're doing here?" "I'm a surgeon," Malachi said, his voice calm but firm. "I was picking up notes for tomorrow's procedure." The officer raised an eyebrow, his eyes scanning the interior of the car. His gaze lingered on Jada, who shrank back slightly in her seat. "And her?" the officer asked, nodding toward Jada. "She's my niece," Malachi replied. "Is there something specific you're looking for, or are we free to go?" The second officer stepped closer, his flashlight aimed at the back seat. "Mind if we take a look inside the vehicle?" "Yes, I mind," Malachi said sharply. "Unless you have probable cause or a warrant, you're not searching my car." The first officer's expression hardened. "No need to get defensive, sir. We're just doing our job." Malachi took a deep breath, willing himself to stay composed. "Your job doesn't include harassing law-abiding citizens. Now, if you don't have anything else, we'll be on our way." There was a tense silence as the officers exchanged a glance. Finally, the first officer stepped back, waving them through with a curt motion. "Have a good night," he said, his tone clipped. Malachi rolled up the window and drove off, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Jada sat quietly beside him, her earlier excitement replaced by unease. "Does that happen a lot?" she asked softly. He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "More than it should." Back at home, after Jada had gone to bed, Malachi sat alone in his study. The events of the evening played over in his mind like a broken record, each moment sharpening his frustration. He had spent his life proving himself, earning degrees, saving lives, building a reputation that demanded respect. And yet, none of it seemed to matter when people saw only his skin. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the framed diplomas and awards that lined the walls. They were symbols of his achievements, but tonight, they felt like empty gestures. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from a colleague at the hospital. "Heads up. Admin's investigating another case of racial bias complaints. You might want to weigh in. Could use your voice." Malachi stared at the message for a long moment. He had always tried to lead by example, addressing these issues quietly and professionally. But tonight, something in him shifted. The weight of the day's indignities, combined with years of navigating a world that refused to see him fully, crystallized into a single thought. It was time to stop being quiet. The city courthouse stood stoic and imposing in the morning light, its limestone facade gleaming under a pale sky. Malachi adjusted his tie as he approached the steps, his mind already racing. Today was critical, a chance to speak on record about the systemic issues he'd observed at the hospital and beyond. The complaint about racial bias in hospital security had spurred an internal investigation, and Malachi had been invited to testify about his own experiences. Jada had wanted to come with him, but he insisted she stay at her dorm. As much as he admired her passion, today's hearing wasn't the place for it. The room would be filled with skeptics and adversaries, people determined to discredit him or dismiss the issue altogether. He needed to focus. "Dr. Bishop!" a voice called out, startling him. He turned to see Mitchell Reyes, a hospital administrator, and one of the few allies he trusted. Mitchell jogged up the steps, his brow furrowed. "Glad I caught you," Mitchell said, falling into step beside him. "I wanted to let you know, I overheard some of the board members talking. They're not happy about you testifying." Malachi's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to make them happy, Mitchell." Mitchell nodded, his face a mix of worry and admiration. "I figured you'd say that. Just be careful. I've seen what happens when people ruffle the wrong feathers." "I've been ruffling feathers my whole life," Malachi said with a faint smile. "Thanks for the heads up." Inside, the courthouse buzzed with energy. Lawyers shuffled between rooms, clerks carried stacks of paperwork, and the low murmur of conversations filled the air. Malachi made his way to the chamber where the hearing would take place, feeling the weight of each step. The room was modest but formal, with rows of wooden benches facing a raised panel where the hospital's internal review committee sat. At the far end of the room, a group of security officers loitered near the back wall, their eyes narrowing as Malachi entered. He ignored them and took a seat near the front, where he spotted another familiar face, Sandra Clemens, a nurse who had filed one of the original complaints. She gave him a small, nervous smile, and he nodded in return. The hearing began with opening remarks from the committee chair, a stern woman in a navy blazer who outlined the purpose of the investigation, to determine whether policies and practices within the hospital's security team were discriminatory. As the first witnesses were called, Malachi listened intently. Sandra described an incident where she was stopped and questioned while leaving her shift, despite clearly wearing her hospital ID badge. Another nurse recounted being followed to her car by a security guard who claimed she looked suspicious. Each story was met with murmurs from the audience, but the committee's expressions remained neutral. When it was finally Malachi's turn to testify, the room seemed to hold its breath. He approached the podium with steady steps, adjusting the microphone before speaking. "Good morning. My name is Dr. Malachi Bishop, and I serve as the Chief of Neurosurgery at St. Vincent's Hospital." He paused, scanning the faces of the committee. "I'm here today not just as a physician, but as a black man who has spent decades navigating spaces where my presence is questioned, even when my credentials are beyond reproach." The room was silent as he recounted the incident with the security guard outside the hospital. He described the subtle biases he'd observed, the ways colleagues of color were treated differently, and the culture of complacency that allowed these patterns to persist. "This isn't about isolated incidents," Malachi said, his voice rising slightly. "It's about a system that allows these biases to go unchecked. It's about creating an environment where every employee, every patient, feels valued and respected, regardless of their background." When he finished, the committee chair thanked him and opened the floor to questions. That's when the tension in the room shifted. "Dr. Bishop," a man in a gray suit began. He was a lawyer representing the hospital's security firm. "You've painted a very compelling picture, but isn't it possible that these so-called incidents are simply misunderstandings? After all, security personnel are trained to be vigilant." Malachi met the lawyer's gaze, his expression unflinching. "Vigilance doesn't require bias. There's a difference between protecting the hospital and profiling its staff." The lawyer smirked, leaning forward. "And yet, you've provided no concrete evidence of systemic bias. Isn't this just a matter of perception?" Before Malachi could respond, Sandra stood from her seat. "Perception doesn't bruise your dignity," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "It doesn't make you feel like you don't belong in your own workplace." The lawyer frowned, clearly caught off guard. Malachi glanced at Sandra, gratitude flickering in his eyes. "Thank you, Miss Clemens," the committee chair said, her tone firm. "Please allow Dr. Bishop to continue." The questioning dragged on, each inquiry designed to undermine Malachi's credibility or minimize the severity of the issues he'd raised. But he remained calm, responding with precision and refusing to be rattled. By the time the hearing concluded, the tension in the room was palpable. As the audience began to disperse, Malachi caught sight of the security officers lingering near the exit, their eyes following him like hawks. He squared his shoulders and walked past them, his resolve unshaken. Outside, Mitchell was waiting on the steps. "How'd it go?" he asked. Malachi exhaled. It went. Before Mitchell could reply, a voice called out sharply behind them, "Dr. Bishop!" Malachi turned to see one of the security officers from the hearing striding toward him. It was Officer Daniels, a tall man with a buzz cut and an air of authority. "Yes?" Malachi said, his tone neutral. Daniels stopped a few feet away, his expression hard. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About the fact that you're making our department look bad," Daniels said, his voice low but laced with menace. "You think you can just walk in there and accuse us of being racist without consequences?" Mitchell stepped forward, his hand raised. "Hey, back off. He's just—" "This doesn't concern you," Daniels snapped, cutting him off. Malachi held up a hand, signaling Mitchell to stand down. He met Daniels' glare head-on. "I presented facts. If those facts make you uncomfortable, that's your problem." Daniels took a step closer, his posture aggressive. "Watch yourself, Bishop. You're stirring up trouble you don't want." Malachi didn't flinch. "Is that a threat, officer?" Daniels smirked, but before he could respond, another voice cut in. "That's enough." A woman in a sharp black suit approached, her expression cold. It was Angela Hart, the hospital's legal counsel. "Officer Daniels, I suggest you leave before this becomes an HR issue." Daniels hesitated, his jaw tightening. Then, with a final glare at Malachi, he turned and walked away. Angela turned to Malachi, her eyes softening slightly. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady. "Thank you." She nodded, then looked at Mitchell. "Make sure he gets to his car safely." Mitchell nodded, and the two of them walked toward the parking lot. As they reached Malachi's car, Mitchell sighed. "This isn't over, is it?" "No," Malachi said, unlocking the door. "But it's a start." The sharp chill of the evening air seemed to bite deeper as Malachi stepped into the quiet parking garage. His mind churned, replaying the hearing, Daniel's aggression, and the veiled threats he'd faced. The stark fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their glow casting long, ominous shadows. Mitchell walked beside him, his usually relaxed demeanor now stiff with tension. "You sure you're okay?" Mitchell asked, glancing around the nearly empty garage. "I'm fine," Malachi replied, his voice steady. "But Daniels isn't going to let this go, neither will the people he represents." Mitchell rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling heavily. "You stirred the pot, Mal." "Not that I blame you. Hell, it needed stirring. But these people, they don't play fair." "I didn't get this far by playing fair, Mitchell," Malachi said, stopping beside his car. "But if we keep tiptoeing around their egos, nothing changes." Mitchell opened his mouth to respond but froze, his eyes narrowing. "Hold up," he said quietly. "Do you see that?" Malachi followed his gaze. A dark sedan idled near the garage exit, its engine rumbling softly. The windows were tinted, and though he couldn't see who was inside, he felt the weight of their gaze. "Stay here," Mitchell said, his voice low. "I'll check it out." "No," Malachi said, stepping in front of him. "You don't know who or what we're dealing with." As if on cue, the sedan's headlights flicked on, cutting through the dim garage. The engine revved, and for a moment, Malachi thought it would barrel toward them. Instead, the car peeled out of the lot, its tires screeching against the concrete. Mitchell let out a shaky breath. "What the hell was that?" "A warning," Malachi said grimly. He opened his car door and turned to Mitchell. "Go home, I'll be fine." Mitchell hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Call me if you need anything seriously." "I will." Malachi waited until Mitchell had disappeared into the stairwell before climbing into his car. As he drove home, his thoughts remained on the sedan, who had been watching Daniels. Someone higher up. He gripped the wheel tightly, knowing this was just the beginning. The next morning, Malachi's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Angela Hart, the hospital's legal counsel. "Dr. Bishop, we need to speak urgent. Please come to my office at your earliest convenience." Malachi frowned, but quickly got dressed and headed to the hospital. When he arrived, Angela's assistant ushered him into the office without delay. Angela sat behind her desk, her usual composed demeanor tinged with tension. "Dr. Bishop," she began, motioning for him to sit. "Thank you for coming. I wanted to give you a heads up before this goes public." She slid a folder across the desk. Malachi opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. His chest tightened as he read the words. Accusations of impropriety, allegations of misconduct, baseless claims that he had leveraged his position for personal gain. "This is absurd," he said, his voice cold. "These are lies." Angela nodded. "I know, but the timing is no coincidence. Someone is trying to discredit you. Make your testimony look like retaliation rather than a call for accountability." "Daniels," Malachi said, the name falling from his lips like a curse. "Possibly," Angela said, "but this feels bigger than just him. These accusations are being circulated to the board and hospital donors. If they gain traction, it could damage your reputation and your career." Malachi closed the folder, his jaw tightening. "What do you recommend?" "We fight back," Angela said firmly. "I've already started drafting a response, but you'll need to be prepared. This won't be a short battle." Malachi nodded, his resolve hardening. "I've spent my life preparing for battles like this. Let's make sure they regret starting it." The accusations hit the hospital's network that afternoon, spreading like wildfire. Anonymous emails circulated among staff, and whispers filled the halls. By the time Malachi returned to his office, the tension was palpable. A knock on the door broke his focus. It was Sandra Clemens, the nurse who had spoken out at the hearing. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "Dr. Bishop," she said hesitantly, "I heard about everything. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for, Sandra," Malachi said, motioning for her to sit. "This isn't your fault." "But it feels like it is," she said, her voice trembling. "I spoke up because I thought it would make a difference. Now they're coming after you." "That's what they do," Malachi said gently. "When they can't silence the truth, they attack the person telling it. But that doesn't mean we stop." Sandra nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "If there's anything I can do to help." "Just keep being brave," Malachi said. "We'll get through this." After Sandra left, Malachi leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He needed a plan, a way to not just defend himself, but to turn the tide. His thoughts were interrupted by another knock, this one sharper, more insistent. The door swung open, revealing Officer Daniels. He stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. "You've got some nerve," Daniels said, his voice low and dangerous. Malachi stood, his expression calm but unyielding. "If you're here to threaten me again, you're wasting your time." Daniels smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't a threat, Bishop. It's a warning. Back off or you'll regret it." "I don't respond well to intimidation," Malachi said evenly. "If you have something to say, say it. Otherwise, get out." Daniels took a step closer, his posture menacing. "You think you're untouchable because you've got a fancy title and a bunch of degrees. You're not. People like you never are." Malachi's hands clenched at his sides, but he didn't rise to the bait. "And people like you, cowards who hide behind badges, always overplay their hand." Daniel's smirk faltered for a moment, before he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Malachi exhaled slowly, the encounter leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. That evening, Malachi received another message, this time from Mitchell. "Mal, you need to see this. Check the news." He turned on the TV, and his stomach sank. A local news station was running a segment on the accusations against him, complete with anonymous interviews and sensationalized headlines. The anchor's tone was grave, as they detailed the alleged misconduct, painting a picture of greed and corruption. Malachi sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. This wasn't just about discrediting him, it was about destroying him. But as the initial shock faded, a new determination took its place. If they wanted a fight, he would give them one. Cliffhanger set up. The next morning, Malachi walked into the hospital, his head held high despite the whispers that followed him. In his briefcase was a folder of his own, a carefully compiled dossier, exposing years of systemic corruption within the hospital's leadership, the security team, and beyond. As he approached the administration office, his phone buzzed with a message from Angela. "I've set up a press conference for tomorrow, be ready." Malachi smiled grimly. It was time to take the fight public. The press conference room was electric with tension, buzzing with reporters adjusting their cameras and microphones. Malachi stood behind the curtain, glancing over the folder of evidence in his hands. Angela Hart stood beside him, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp. "You ready?" she asked quietly. Malachi nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be." Angela patted his arm. "Stick to the facts, stay calm. They'll try to rattle you, but you've got this." He took a deep breath as she stepped out to address the audience, opening the press conference with a statement. "Good afternoon," Angela began. "We're here today to address the accusations made against Dr. Malachi Bishop. We will present evidence that not only refutes these claims, but also exposes systemic corruption within the hospital and its affiliated security team. Dr. Bishop will speak shortly and take questions." The curtain was drawn back, and Malachi stepped forward, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his shoulders. Cameras flashed as he approached the podium, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the faces before him. "Thank you for being here," he began, his voice steady. "I've spent my life committed to healing and saving lives. But today, I'm not here as a surgeon, I'm here as a man forced to defend his integrity against baseless accusations. And more importantly, I'm here to shine a light on a system that has perpetuated bias, corruption, and abuse of power for far too long." He opened the folder and began laying out the evidence. Financial records linking senior hospital officials to questionable contracts with the security firm, emails revealing coordinated efforts to suppress complaints, and testimony from employees who had faced similar intimidation tactics. "This is not just about me," Malachi said, his voice rising with conviction. "This is about every person who has been silenced, dismissed, or targeted because they dared to speak the truth, and today, we're taking a stand." The room was silent for a moment, the gravity of his words sinking in. Then, a reporter raised a hand. "Dr. Bishop," she said, "what do you say to those who claim you're using these allegations to deflect from your own misconduct?" Malachi met her gaze without flinching. "I say, let the evidence speak for itself. Every claim against me has been fabricated, and we have the proof to show it." Another reporter chimed in. "What about the threats you've reportedly received? Are you concerned for your safety?" Malachi hesitated, but before he could respond, a commotion erupted at the back of the room. The doors swung open, and Officer Daniels stormed in, flanked by two uniformed officers. The air grew thick with tension as Daniels approached the podium. "Dr. Bishop," Daniels called out, his voice loud and confrontational. "Why don't you tell everyone here the truth about who you really are?" Angela stepped forward, placing herself between Malachi and Daniels. "Officer Daniels, this is a press conference, not your personal stage. If you have something to say, file a complaint like everyone else." Daniels ignored her, his eyes locked on Malachi. "You think you're a hero, don't you?" he sneered. "Exposing corruption, fighting injustice. What a story! But you're just another liar trying to play the victim." Malachi took a step forward, his posture unyielding. "And you're just another bully hiding behind a badge." Gasps rippled through the room, and Daniel's face twisted with anger. He pointed a finger at Malachi. "You don't know who you're messing with." "Oh, I think I do," Malachi said, his voice calm but cutting. "You're the kind of man who thrives on intimidation because deep down, you're terrified of being exposed for what you really are, a coward." Daniels lunged toward the podium, but the other officers grabbed him, pulling him back. The room erupted into chaos as reporters shouted questions, and cameras captured every second of the confrontation. Angela seized the moment, stepping back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's clear who the real aggressor is here. Officer Daniels, your behavior speaks volumes about the culture we're trying to dismantle." Daniels struggled against the officers holding him, his face red with fury. "This isn't over, Bishop," he shouted. "You hear me? This isn't over." Malachi stared at him, his expression unwavering. "You're right," he said. "It's just beginning." Later that evening, Malachi sat in Angela's office, his hands clasped tightly as he replayed the confrontation in his mind. Angela paced the room, her phone buzzing incessantly with calls and messages. "Well, that was unexpected," she said, setting her phone down. "But in a way, it worked in our favor. Daniels showed his true colors in front of everyone." Malachi nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. "He's desperate, and desperate people are dangerous." Angela sighed. "You're not wrong, but we have the upper hand now. The public's on your side, and the evidence is damning. Daniels and his allies are running out of options. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Mitchell, his expression grave. "We've got a problem," he said, holding up his phone. "Look at this." He handed it to Malachi, who watched a grainy video playing on the screen. It was security footage from the hospital parking lot. The night Daniels had confronted him. After the hearing, the video had been edited, splicing together selective clips to make it appear as though Malachi had provoked the encounter. "They're trying to frame me," Malachi said, his voice low but furious. "Again." Angela grabbed the phone, her eyes narrowing as she watched the footage. "This is sloppy," she said. "Anyone who looks closely will see it's been doctored." "Doesn't matter," Mitchell said. "The damage is already done, it's trending on social media, and people are eating it up." Malachi's jaw tightened. "We need to release the full, unedited footage now." Angela nodded. "I'll handle it, but you need to prepare for what comes next. Daniels isn't going to stop until he's taken down with irrefutable evidence." "I'm ready," Malachi said, his voice resolute. "Whatever it takes." Cliffhanger setup. As Angela worked to release the unedited footage, Malachi began reviewing the final pieces of evidence in his possession. Among them was a document he hadn't fully examined before, an internal memo linking Daniels to a network of bribery and misconduct within the hospital and city government. Malachi's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You're digging too deep, walk away, or you won't like what happens next." He stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. The fight wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about exposing the entire system for what it was. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that prickled along the skin and made every breath feel heavy. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a cold glare over the oak-paneled walls. Malachi stood tall, his sharp suit immaculate, a stark contrast to the turbulence within. At the other table sat Officer Daniels, his arms crossed, his glare aimed straight at Malachi. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community leaders, hospital staff, and even patients who had come to see justice in action. Angela sat beside Malachi, her tablet buzzing with updates as new developments streamed in from her team. The judge, an imposing woman with a steely gaze, called the room to order. "We are here to examine allegations against Officer Jonathan Daniels and his role in systemic corruption, abuse of power, and harassment. Let the hearing commence." The prosecutor stood first, laying out the case with meticulous precision. The timeline of events, Daniels' history of complaints, and the damning evidence of his involvement in bribery schemes and fabricated allegations. All meticulously laid bare for the courtroom to absorb. When it was time for the defense, Daniels' lawyer rose, adjusting his tie. His argument was as predictable as it was hollow. "My client is an exemplary officer who has dedicated his career to upholding the law. These accusations are an attempt to discredit him by individuals with ulterior motives, namely, Dr. Malachi Bishop, who has a vested interest in destroying my client's reputation." Malachi's fingers tightened on the table's edge, but he kept his composure. He wouldn't give Daniels or his attorney the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. When Malachi was called to testify, the energy in the room shifted. All eyes were on him as he approached the stand, his calm demeanor masking the fire within. He took the oath and sat, his back straight and his gaze unwavering. "Dr. Bishop," the prosecutor began, "can you describe your first encounter with Officer Daniels?" Malachi recounted the night in the hospital parking lot, his voice steady. He described Daniels' confrontational behavior, the threats, and the clear intent to intimidate. He spoke of the doctored footage and the relentless campaign to undermine him. "And do you have evidence to support your claims?" Malachi nodded. "Yes. Not only do I have the unedited footage, but I also have internal documents and emails linking Officer Daniels to a broader network of corruption." The prosecutor presented the evidence to the court. Time-stamped footage that contradicted Daniels' narrative, financial records showing unexplained deposits to his accounts, and an incriminating email thread where Daniels discussed silencing Malachi. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, but the judge's gavel quickly restored order. When Daniels was called to testify, he strode to the stand with feigned confidence. His defense was aggressive, deflecting blame and painting himself as a victim of a vendetta. But as the prosecutor cross-examined him, the cracks in his facade began to show. "Officer Daniels," the prosecutor said, "can you explain this email?" He handed over a printed copy of a message where Daniels had referred to Malachi as a problem that needs solving. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "It's being taken out of context." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "What context justifies silencing a man for speaking the truth?" Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but faltered, his face reddening. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on him. When it was Angela's turn, she brought out the final piece of evidence, a whistleblower from within the security firm who testified via video link. The whistleblower described how Daniels had orchestrated false accusations, targeted employees of color, and used his position to enrich himself. As the testimony unfolded, Daniels' expression darkened, his mask of control slipping further with each damning word. By the time the whistleblower finished, Daniels looked like a man cornered. The climax came when Daniels broke under the weight of the evidence. "You think you're better than me?" Daniels spat, his voice loud enough to echo through the courtroom. "You stand there with your degrees and your perfect life, but you don't know what it's like to work in the real world. You don't know the pressure we face every day." Malachi stood, his voice calm but cutting. "The pressure to harass, to abuse your power. Don't mistake my determination for naivety. I know exactly what it's like to fight for every inch of respect and safety in a system designed to deny it. And I'm here because people like you exploit that system." Daniels pointed a trembling finger at Malachi. "You don't belong here." "And that," Malachi said, his voice rising, "is the heart of the matter. Isn't it people like me? Black, accomplished, unyielding. We terrify you because we dismantle the lies you tell yourself about superiority and control, but your fear doesn't excuse your actions." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the tension snapping like a coiled spring. The judge slammed her gavel repeatedly. "Order!" The judge called for a recess to deliberate, leaving the room charged with anticipation. Malachi returned to his seat, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. Angela leaned over. "You handled that perfectly," she said. "Now we wait." As the courtroom emptied for the recess, Daniels was escorted out, his face a mask of barely contained rage. But as he passed Malachi, he muttered under his breath, "This isn't over." Malachi met his gaze, unflinching. "For you, it is." When the court reconvened, the judge's expression was unreadable as she prepared to deliver the verdict. The weight of every decision, every confrontation, pressed on Malachi like a tidal wave. "As I deliver this judgment," the judge began, her voice steady but firm, "I remind this court that justice is not a weapon of convenience, but a tool of truth." The room held its breath. The courtroom was silent, as Judge Ramirez scanned the room, her gaze steady and unyielding. The air was charged, every eye locked on her, every breath held. Malachi sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture poised, but his hands clenched tightly beneath the surface. Beside him, Angela's steady presence was a quiet reassurance. Across the room, Officer Daniels sat slumped, his once overbearing confidence now replaced with a veneer of tension, barely masking his fury. Judge Ramirez's voice was clear and resonant. After reviewing the evidence presented, including testimony from credible witnesses, video recordings, and internal communications, it is the court's decision that Officer Jonathan Daniels is guilty of abuse of power, harassment, and falsification of evidence. This conduct constitutes a gross violation of public trust. A collective exhale swept through the room, followed by a murmur of subdued cheers and whispers. Daniels' face paled, his jaw tightening as if to hold back the torrent of emotions threatening to spill out. Malachi sat still, letting the words wash over him. Relief mingled with a quiet resolve. This victory was not the end, but a step forward. Daniels faces consequences. The courtroom buzzed as the gavel slammed down, signaling the hearing's conclusion. Reporters scrambled to file their stories, while community members exchanged embraces and tearful expressions of gratitude. For them, this wasn't just justice for Malachi, it was a message that change was possible. Daniels was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his once imposing figure diminished. As he passed Malachi, he sneered, his voice low but venomous. "You think this is over? You'll regret this." Malachi turned to face him, his expression calm and resolute. The only thing I regret is that it took this long for you to face the truth. Daniels was led away, his threats now hollow against the backdrop of his public disgrace. Angela leaned toward Malachi as the crowd began to disperse. You did it. Malachi shook his head slightly. We did it. But this is just one battle. The system that allowed him to thrive still exists. Angela smiled faintly. And you're already thinking about how to dismantle it. Protagonist's growth. Later that evening, Malachi stood alone on the rooftop of his apartment building, the city lights stretching out before him. The weight of the past weeks pressed on him, but for the first time, he felt lighter. Not unburdened, but steadier. Mitchell joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need this, he said, handing one to Malachi. Malachi accepted it with a small smile. Thanks. They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the city below filling the space. You know, Mitchell began, a lot of people would have walked away, taken the easier path. I couldn't, Malachi replied. Not when so much was at stake. It wasn't just about me, it was about every person Daniels hurt, every voice silenced by fear. Mitchell nodded. And now? Now, Malachi said. We keep going. Daniels was a symptom, not the disease. The hospital, the police department, the city, they all need accountability. This is just the beginning. The fallout from the case was swift and far-reaching. Daniels' conviction triggered a chain reaction, with internal investigations launched into the hospital's ties to the corrupt security firm. Several senior administrators resigned under pressure, and the hospital announced sweeping reforms, including the establishment of an independent oversight board. The police department faced similar scrutiny. Activist groups seized the momentum, demanding transparency and accountability. Public pressure mounted, forcing the city council to approve funding for body cameras, stricter oversight of law enforcement, and a civilian review board. In the weeks following the trial, Malachi became a reluctant figurehead for the movement. Community leaders invited him to speak at rallies, and his story was shared widely in the media. While the attention was overwhelming, it also reinforced his belief that change required sustained effort. Emotional closure. 1. Quiet evening, Malachi visited the community center where his late father had once organized voter registration drives. The space was alive with activity. Children laughing, volunteers distributing meals, and families gathering in shared hope. He paused in front of a mural on the wall, its vibrant colors depicting scenes of resilience and unity. You'd be proud of this, he murmured, his voice soft. You always said the fight wasn't about winning. It was about making sure the next generation had it easier. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Bishop. He turned to see Sandra Clemens, the nurse who had testified at the trial. She held a small bouquet of flowers, her expression earnest. I just wanted to thank you for everything. Because of you, people like me feel seen. Malachi smiled, accepting the flowers. Thank you, Sandra. It took all of us to get here. She nodded and rejoined her family, leaving Malachi with a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but moments like this reminded him why it mattered. As Malachi returned to his car, his phone buzzed with a message from Angela. New lead, more to uncover. Let's talk tomorrow. He stared at the screen for a moment before typing his response. Let's keep going. As he drove away, the city lights blurred into a kaleidoscope of possibility. The road ahead was uncertain, but Malachi was ready for it. Every step forward, every battle fought, brought them closer to the justice his father had dreamed of, a justice that left no one behind. The courtroom victory against Officer Daniels marked the end of a grueling chapter in Malachi Bishop's life, but it wasn't the conclusion of the larger story. As he left the courthouse that day, surrounded by a mix of applause and media frenzy, Malachi felt the weight of what had been accomplished, but also the enormity of what still lay ahead. The experience had tested every facet of his character. He had faced humiliation, betrayal, and threats, but he had also discovered reserves of strength and resilience he hadn't realized he possessed. For Malachi, the fight against Daniels was never just about clearing his own name, it was about creating a ripple effect, one that would challenge the systems that enabled people like Daniels to thrive and hold others back. Before the ordeal, Malachi had lived by a simple philosophy: let your work speak for itself. He had believed that excellence could transcend prejudice, that results would overshadow bias. But the events of the past months shattered that illusion. He saw firsthand how entrenched systems of power could corrupt even the clearest truths and how they thrived on the silence of those who dared not challenge them. Now, Malachi knew that silence was complicity. He emerged from the experience more determined than ever to be a voice for change. His initial reluctance to step into the spotlight had given way to an understanding that his story carried weight, not because of who he was, but because it represented the experiences of so many others. He learned that his voice could amplify theirs, and he was prepared to use it. Malachi also learned to lean on his allies. Angela, Mitchell, and others had stood by him when it mattered most, showing him the power of collective action. The weight of injustice didn't have to be borne alone. It was a shared burden, one that became lighter when carried together. The case against Daniels wasn't just about one corrupt officer. It was about the culture that allowed him to operate unchecked for years. The trial exposed more than Daniels's actions. It revealed a web of complicity stretching across law enforcement, hospital administration, and city governance. It brought to light the everyday injustices endured by people who lacked the privilege or platform to fight back. The revelations were a wake-up call for the community. Protests turned into policy discussions. Activist groups pushed for reforms with renewed vigor. The hospital instituted whistleblower protections, while the police department faced federal oversight and the creation of a civilian review board. These were small but significant steps, reminders that progress is incremental but achievable. Malachi understood that dismantling systemic injustice was like performing delicate surgery. It required precision, patience, and a willingness to confront what was beneath the surface. The changes sparked by Daniel's downfall were just the beginning of a long process, but they were proof that the system could be challenged, and more importantly, changed. Late one night, Malachi found himself in his father's study, surrounded by the remnants of a life spent fighting for justice. The room was filled with worn books, faded photographs of civil rights marches, and handwritten notes from a man who had dedicated his life to a cause. Malachi picked up a framed photograph of his father, standing with a group of activists, their faces resolute, their fists raised in solidarity. He remembered how his father used to say, "The fight for justice isn't a sprint, it's a relay. You carry the baton as far as you can, then you pass it on." For the first time in months, Malachi allowed himself a moment to breathe, to process. He wasn't naive enough to believe the fight was over, but he felt a sense of peace, knowing he had done his part, and that he wasn't running the race alone. The story of Malachi Bishop and Officer Daniels resonated far beyond the courtroom. It became a case study in how individuals and communities could challenge systemic injustice. It highlighted the importance of evidence, strategy, and perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds, and it underscored the need for accountability, not just for individuals like Daniels, but for the systems that enabled them. The trial also sparked difficult conversations. People began questioning their own biases, reconsidering their roles in perpetuating inequality. For some, the story was a call to action. For others, it was a reminder of the work still to be done. Perhaps the most significant impact was the renewed sense of possibility. The trial showed that even in a flawed system, change was possible when people refused to accept the status quo. It inspired a new wave of activism, bringing together voices from all walks of life to demand a better, fairer future. Malachi's journey is a testament to the power of resilience and courage. It's a reminder that standing up for what's right often comes at a cost, but that cost is worth it when the stakes are justice, dignity, and equality. For those who feel powerless in the face of injustice, Malachi's story offers hope. It shows that even one voice can make a difference when backed by determination and truth. It encourages us to question, to challenge, and to act, not just for ourselves, but for those who cannot. And while the story ends here, the fight continues. Each of us carries the responsibility to push back against prejudice, to hold power accountable, and to create a world where justice is not the exception, but the rule. As Malachi walked into a community rally weeks later, he was greeted by a wave of applause. Activists, families, and community leaders had gathered to celebrate the reforms set in motion by the trial and to strategize for the battles ahead. Taking the stage, Malachi addressed the crowd, with the same calm resolve that had carried him through the trial. "This fight isn't about me," he began. "It's about all of us. About the people who came before us, and the people who will come after us. It's about building a future where no one has to fight alone, and where justice is more than just a word. It's a way of life." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy a palpable force. As Malachi stepped down, Angela met him with a smile. "Ready for what's next?" she asked. Malachi nodded. "Always." As the sun set over the rally, its golden light spilling across the faces of those gathered, one thing was clear: the journey wasn't over, but neither was the hope that fueled it. And with that, Malachi Bishop walked forward, ready to carry the baton for as long as it took. This story leaves us with a challenge: to look beyond the surface, to question the systems we take for granted, and to stand firm in the face of injustice. Change is possible, but it requires all of us to play our part. The fight for justice is ongoing, but as Malachi's story shows, progress begins with a single step, and the courage to take it.